There are moments, my brothers and sisters, when a message crosses the ocean and does not arrive as mere sound. It arrives as a weight, as a memory, as a stirring in the bones of a people who have carried far too much for far too long. And when the elders of Jamaica heard the words sent from Captain Ibrahim Traoré, many of them did not simply listen, they remembered. They remembered the storms, the betrayals, the disappointments, the empty promises that had echoed through Kingston and Montego Bay for generation after generation. And our African-American elders, those of you sitting in living rooms in Atlanta, Brooklyn, Detroit, and Chicago, you understood something the very second you heard it because you, too, have lived long enough to know the difference between a politician's speech and a truth that burns its way through the air. So come close, come slow. Let us open this story the way our grandmothers opened their Bibles, gently, reverently, ready for revelation. And if this message reaches you, if it stirs you, let your voice join ours. Do remember to subscribe not as a formality, but as a shared stand, a shared witness, a shared journey. There are stories that begin with thunder, and there are stories that begin with silence. This one, my friends, began with the kind of silence that visits an island after a storm. Jamaica had just endured the fierce winds and rains of Hurricane Melissa, a storm that tore through roofs, uprooted century-old trees, and left many elders standing in the remains of homes they had spent a lifetime building. In communities from St. Thomas to St. Anne, old men sat outside broken verandas, staring at the sky, as if asking whether heaven still kept watch. Grandmothers, wrapped in damp shawls, waited for officials who never came, waited for answers that never arrived. And one elder, a soft-spoken retired teacher from Spanish Town, whispered to a neighbor, "It feels as though our suffering has become invisible." That sentence, spoken quietly beneath the weight of despair, traveled from one household to another until it reached the ears of a small community group in Kingston. These elders, most in their 70s, had long met weekly to discuss local affairs, Caribbean history, and the writings of Marcus Garvey. After the disaster, they gathered in a cramped church basement, surrounded by melted candles and stacks of donated blankets, and they made a decision that would change everything that followed. They wrote a letter. Not a letter to their government, for the government had already given its statements, its statistics, its polished explanations. Not a letter to foreign donors, for the donors were busy with their own calculations. No, these elders wrote to Africa. They chose Burkina Faso because, in their words, "We have seen dignity in the young captain from Ouagadougou." They watched his speeches online. They heard the firmness in his tone, and something about his refusal to bow moved them deeply. The letter was simple, written on the back of a donated notebook page. It spoke of loss, of fear, of the loneliness that disaster can carve into the heart of a poor nation. But it also spoke of pride, of a people with a long memory and a longing for connection with the continent that had birthed their ancestors. The final line of the letter read, "We do not ask for money. We ask to be seen." Days later, that letter passed hand to hand, sent through Diaspora contacts, carried across the Atlantic in the most humble manner, reached Ouagadougou. It landed on a wooden table during a meeting of ministers reviewing security reports and agricultural projections. Captain Ibrahim Traoré listened as an aide explained where the letter had come from. Then, in the midst of complex political discussions, the room fell unexpectedly still. Here was a message not from diplomats, not from powerful nations, but from elders who looked like his own grandparents, elders whose voices carried the echoes of a shared history. Traoré asked for the letter to be read aloud, and as the words filled the room, the expressions of the ministers shifted from curiosity to sympathy to something heavier recognition. For a moment, the young leader did not speak. He simply placed his palms flat upon the table, closed his eyes, and breathed deeply. And then he said, "We will answer them." One advisor leaned forward, reminding him that resources were tight, that international pressure was high, that priorities were already stretched. Traoré shook his head. "Our people across the sea have called to us. When our ancestors cried, no one answered. We cannot repeat that silence." It was, for many in that room, an Ibrahim Traoré moment, a realization that leadership was not merely administration. Leadership was memory, duty, and the echo of those who came before. Later that evening, in a modest recording room without fanfare, Traoré sat before a single microphone to prepare his response. He did not summon a speechwriter. He did not craft a diplomatic message. He spoke plainly, slowly, as though speaking to family. He spoke of storms, of solidarity, of the obligation leaders owe to the forgotten. He spoke directly to the elders of Jamaica, acknowledging their courage and their pain. And as he spoke, a technician watching from across the room felt something tightening in his throat. For this was not politics. This was a young African leader speaking to an older Caribbean generation with the tenderness of a grandson and the firmness of a guardian. Across the ocean, in Jamaica, elders waited in dimly lit homes, unaware that a reply was already forming thousands of miles away. They did not know what shape it would take. They did not know which words would travel back to them. They only knew that their message had been sent a fragile bottle cast into a wide, unpredictable sea. And when the message finally reached them, when the audio began to circulate through radios and mobile phones, something happened that Jamaica had not felt in many years. Something was about to break, and something was about to awaken. But what Jamaica heard next was not comfort. It was fire. When the message from Ouagadougou finally reached the Caribbean, it did not arrive with trumpets. It did not come packaged in ceremony or politics. It came the way truth always comes, to the oppressed, quietly, powerfully, slipping through the cracks of ordinary life until it stands at the very center of the heart. On a humid Thursday evening, in a modest house in St. Catherine, an elderly couple sat beside a battery-powered radio because the electricity had still not returned. The man's hands trembled as he adjusted the dial. The woman whispered a small hymn under her breath, the same hymn she had sung during Hurricane Gilbert many decades earlier. And then, as the static settled, the voice of Captain Ibrahim Traoré filled the room. It traveled through Jamaica like a wind that was not of this world, steady, deliberate, charged. His tone was not the tone of a politician issuing condolences. It was the tone of a man who had seen hardship, who recognized hardship, and who refused to look away from hardship. He began by naming the suffering plainly, no euphemisms, no padded phrasing, no soft political sugar. He spoke of elders losing their roofs, of farmers losing their crops, of mothers losing sleep because they had no dry place to lay their children at night. He said, "Your pain has reached us, not your country, not your region, not your demographic." He said, "Your pain." And in that moment, for the first time in years, countless Jamaicans felt that someone far away had actually seen them. As his message traveled through Montego Bay, May Pen, Savannah Lamar, and the hills of Portland, something astonishing happened. Elders cried openly, not from weakness, but from the exhaustion of holding too much for too long. Some placed their hands over their hearts. Others bowed their heads in reverence, not to a leader, but to the simple miracle of being acknowledged. In a small church in Clarendon, an elderly pastor listened to Traoré's words through a cheap Bluetooth speaker. His eyes widened. His shoulders shook. Finally, he exclaimed, "This is how leaders spoke in the days of old. Where has this spirit been? Where has this honesty gone?" Members of the congregation nodded through their tears. One elderly woman whispered, "It has been decades since I felt spoken to like this." But it was not only the tenderness that moved Jamaica. It was the fire. Traoré did not shy away from truth. He did not pretend that political failures had not deepened the wounds left by the hurricane. Without naming names, without accusations, he spoke about the sacred duty of leadership, to protect, to uplift, to defend the most vulnerable. His tone sharpened as he declared that a people's dignity must never be collateral in political games. He spoke as if addressing every leader who had ever forgotten the faces of the poor. Across the island, that fire sparked debates. Radio hosts on Caribbean talk shows asked, "Why is it that a man from Burkina Faso speaks with more clarity about our suffering than our own leaders?" Callers flooded the phone lines. Some were angry, some were ashamed, some were energized. One retired fisherman from Ocho Rios said, "We needed someone to tell the truth. We just did not expect the truth to come from Africa." Meanwhile, in the diaspora from New York to Toronto, from London to Birmingham, Caribbean, elders replayed the message on their phones. Some listened while sitting in their kitchens. Others shared it in WhatsApp groups filled with family updates, photos of grandchildren, and prayer reminders. For them, this message felt like a circle long broken and finally repaired. A Ghanaian grandmother living in Harlem listened in silence before whispering, "We were never meant to be strangers to one another." A Barbadian elder living in Brooklyn said, "Hear the man's courage. Hear the man's conviction. This is a spirit we thought was lost." Scholars and analysts also reacted, trying to understand how the message had traveled so far, so fast. Some attempted to label it strategic. Others dismissed it as emotional rhetoric. But those who had lived history recognized something more profound. They saw in Traoré's words the old cadence of global black resistance, the insistence that dignity cannot be negotiated, the echo of Garvey, the echo of Fanon, the echo of every elder who had ever prayed for unity between the Caribbean and the African continent. For many, this moment became the defining Ibrahim Traoré reaction, a phrase repeated across social media as elders expressed both admiration and disbelief. But the reaction was not universal praise. Some politicians in Jamaica grew uncomfortable. Some journalists questioned the appropriateness of an African leader speaking so boldly. A few international observers muttered about interference, uneasy about the emotional bridge forming between two regions long kept separate by design. Yet for Jamaica's elders, the message was a balm, a warning, and a revelation all at once. And as the island absorbed the words, as communities debated the responsibility of leadership and the value of dignity, another question began to rise, a question that no one could ignore much longer. Because the ripple of this message did not stop at the shoreline of Jamaica. Something wider was waking, something larger was shifting. For the echo that began in Kingston was already traveling across oceans, and what it awakened next would shake far more than a single island. When a message touches the soul of a people, my friends, the consequences do not unfold like breaking news. They unfold like tides, slow at first, then certain, then overwhelming. The reply from Burkina Faso, spoken with dignity and conviction, began to reshape conversations across Jamaica in ways that even the elders who wrote the letter could not have predicted. In Kingston, elders gathered outside small shops and community centers, replaying the young captain's voice through cracked phone speakers. Many had lost their roofs, their crops, their savings. But what unsettled them most was not the storm. It was the echo of a truth they had avoided for far too long. The truth that leadership, when detached from the people, leaves wounds deeper than any hurricane. Local discussions turned sharp. Older Jamaicans confronted long-standing frustrations, promises unkept, communities neglected, elders forgotten. The storm had exposed physical damage, but Traoré's message exposed the spiritual damage and erosion of trust, a hollowing of national confidence. Some Jamaicans felt shame, others felt pride, but all felt shaken awake. The consequences deepened further when the Diaspora responded. In New York City, Caribbean elders who had moved abroad decades earlier gathered in church basements, the same kinds of basements where civil rights organizing once took root. Trinidadian aunties brought homemade sweetbread. Jamaican grandfathers in wide-brim hats leaned against folding tables. Voices overlapped as people spoke about dignity, sovereignty, and the pain of feeling overlooked by their own homeland. One elderly man from Kingston, now living in Brooklyn, said, "I left Jamaica searching for stability. I worked myself old in this country. But to hear an African leader speak to us like family, after all these years, it woke something I thought was gone." A woman from St. Mary, her hair wrapped in a patterned scarf, whispered, "I did not cry during Hurricane Melissa, but I cried when I heard that message." In communities across Chicago, Detroit, and Atlanta, African American elders also joined the conversation. Though they were not Jamaican, they recognized the tone, the courage, and the sting of truth. They remembered moments in their own history when honesty had come at a high cost. They remembered leaders who had been punished for speaking boldly. They remembered watching their communities struggle under the weight of neglect. One retired steelworker from Detroit said to his church group, "This is familiar. This is the sound we grew up on, the sound of a man who refuses to bow." A grandmother in Chicago, seated beside her cane, nodded solemnly and replied, "And every time we heard that tone, it meant change was standing at the door." Some elders even began revisiting the work of Marcus Garvey, tracing the lines between the Caribbean and Africa across a century of broken connections. Sermons in small churches in Atlanta and Harlem invoked Garvey's name again, not as a distant historical figure, but as a man whose voice might finally be resonating through a new generation of leadership. Meanwhile, young people reacted differently. Many teenagers and young adults felt embarrassment that an outsider, albeit an African brother, had spoken truths they wished their own leaders had spoken first. Some felt inspired, empowered. Others felt defensive, even angry. But all recognized that a mirror had been placed before them, and it reflected not only tragedy, but potential. In Jamaica's universities, students held discussions about political accountability. In Kingston's taxi stands, drivers debated the meaning of leadership. In Montego Bay, fishermen talked about sovereignty while repairing nets damaged by the storm. The reaction was not uniform, but the awakening was undeniable. Yet the most profound consequence came from an unexpected place: the elders of Harlem. In a modest church near West 125th Street, pastors gathered with community members to pray for Jamaica. Afterwards, they reflected on the message itself. One pastor, his voice deepened by decades in ministry, declared, "What we heard was a spiritual indictment. It was not criticism. It was a call. A call for the Caribbean, for Africa, and for us right here in Black America to open our eyes to one another again." Across the congregation, heads bowed as though receiving a revelation. For some, the message highlighted the interconnectedness of Black suffering worldwide. For others, it offered hope, a sign that leadership rooted in courage had not disappeared from the global South. But not everyone welcomed the consequences. Some government officials in Kingston felt pressured. Some commentators accused the Jamaican public of overreacting. Some foreign observers suggested the Caribbean should focus on domestic matters, subtly uneasy about the emotional bridge forming between Africa and its diaspora. Nevertheless, the consequences were already in motion. A people who had long felt unseen suddenly felt recognized. A diaspora that had drifted into cultural nostalgia suddenly felt reconnected. An older generation that feared their struggles were forgotten suddenly felt remembered. And in living rooms, churches, and street corners across Jamaica, an unspoken question began to rise, quiet, unsettling, powerful. Why did it take an African voice to awaken a Caribbean truth? It was a question with no easy answer, a question that unsettled leaders, inspired elders, and ignited debate across continents. But another question, even larger, even heavier, was beginning to form beyond the Caribbean. One that the world was not prepared to face. For the world had heard the message too, and its response would be far more complicated than Jamaica's. When Jamaica began to stir, the world took notice. And as always, when the Caribbean finds its voice, Washington hears the echo first. In think tanks across the American capital, analysts gathered around screens replaying the young captain's message. Some leaned forward with curiosity, others with concern, and a few with the subtle discomfort that emerges whenever a Black leader speaks with clarity that cannot be ignored. One analyst, adjusting his glasses in a cold conference room, remarked, "This tone is unusual. It is not diplomatic. It is moral." Another replied cautiously, "Moral voices create unpredictable alliances." And that, my friends, was the quiet fear rippling beneath the surface. Across the Atlantic, European observers watched the situation with another kind of unease. For decades, the Caribbean had been a region expected to follow predictable political patterns. Yet now, a message from Burkina Faso, a nation often underestimated by global power structures, had struck a chord powerful enough to challenge those expectations. It reminded some Europeans of long-forgotten colonial entanglements, the kind that thrive only when the oppressed remain divided. Caribbean commentators weighed in as well. Some feared tensions with traditional partners. Others celebrated the moment as a long-awaited embrace between two halves of a scattered people. Many noted that the emotional resonance of the message hinted at something deeper than politics. It hinted at the possibility of Caribbean nations redefining their place in a rapidly shifting world. But perhaps the most important reactions came from African American elders watching from their living rooms in Atlanta, Chicago, Los Angeles, and Philadelphia. These elders had lived through the civil rights era. They had heard prophetic voices before voices that burned through injustice with the precision of Scripture. And as they listened to the message again, they felt a familiar tightening in their chests. A retired teacher in Atlanta said softly, "I know that tone. That is the tone they silenced in our country." A grandmother in Philadelphia, her hands clasped in her lap, responded, "When a leader speaks like that, the world becomes nervous." Harlem scholars, meeting in a community library near Malcolm X the Boulevard, discussed the broader implications. "What we are witnessing," one professor declared, "is a reconnection of the African world across oceans, across generations, across trauma." Another added, "And whenever the African world reconnects, global power structures begin to shift." Around the table, heads nodded in solemn agreement, because they all understood the truth hidden beneath geopolitics. When Black unity deepens, old strategies falter. When Black dignity rises, old narratives collapse. And when a Caribbean island responds to an African leader with emotion and clarity, the world begins to wonder what might come next. But what worried international observers most was not the message itself. It was the possibility that this was only the beginning. For even with pressure mounting from every direction, the young captain refused to yield, and Jamaica was preparing an answer the world did not expect. In the days that followed the message from Ouagadougou, Jamaica did something rare, something beautiful, something that had not happened in a long, long time. It paused. Not the kind of pause born from shock or exhaustion, but a spiritual pause, the kind that comes when a people realize they are standing at a crossroads. Elders across the island began speaking with a gentleness that surprised even their own families. They gathered under breadfruit trees, on cracked verandas, inside churches with leaking roofs, and they repeated a single thought. We must not waste this awakening. These elders had lived through decades of natural storms, political storms, spiritual storms, and they understood more than anyone that revelation is useless without direction. So they began urging the younger generation to lift their heads, to study leadership, to ask questions, to rebuild with dignity rather than resentment. In Montego Bay, youth groups met beside damaged fishing boats and sketched out ideas for community rebuilding. In Spanish Town, young mothers formed small support circles, determined not to wait for distant promises. In St. Elizabeth, farmers spoke about self-reliance, inspired in part by the agricultural revival taking place across Africa. When the message crossed the ocean, the road ahead widened. In Atlanta, members of the Caribbean Diaspora held a town hall meeting in a modest auditorium. Elders spoke slowly, their voices trembling not with age but with the weight of possibility. One elderly Trinidadian man said, "We have spent too long watching the Caribbean suffer from afar. Maybe it is time we lend more than sympathy. Maybe it is time we lend hands." His words found their way into the hearts of African-American elders seated beside him, elders who had marched in Selma, who had stood in church pews after funerals, who recognized the rhythm of a stirring movement. Some offered mentorship to Caribbean youth. Others proposed cultural exchanges, trade networks, storytelling initiatives. A road was forming, not on maps, but in the hearts of a scattered people finally turning toward one another. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, African farmers and community leaders discussed ways to strengthen ties with Caribbean nations. A pastor from St. Lucia living in Nairobi said, "The distance between us was never measured in miles. It was measured in silence. That silence must end." In Harlem, church choirs added quiet prayers for Jamaica during Sunday service. In Brooklyn, elders gathered on brownstone steps and debated the meaning of solidarity. In Kingston, pastors preached about accountability and rebirth. The road ahead was not a perfect one. There were obstacles, political tensions, old wounds still bleeding beneath the surface. But for the first time in many years, the voice of hope was louder than the voice of resignation. Yet even as Jamaica looked forward, another truth loomed like a shadow at the edge of the horizon. A truth the elders could feel deep in their bones. A truth the diaspora whispered about in late-night conversations. Because every awakening, every shift, every rising connection brings with it a question that cannot be escaped, a question that demands courage, a question that demands unity, a question that demands action, and that question was coming. For the next step would not depend on Jamaica alone. It would depend on what all our scattered families decide to do when history knocks once more. My brothers and sisters, when the message from Ouagadougou settled into the heart of Jamaica, something sacred happened. The island did not merely listen, it remembered. It remembered the storms endured, the promises broken, the elders forgotten. And yet, within that memory, a quiet hope began to rise, fragile, trembling, but unmistakably alive. Across living rooms in Kingston, in church halls in Montego Bay, in small kitchens smelling of pepper pot and boiled dumplings, people spoke with a renewed clarity. They understood that the message was never meant to wound them. It was meant to wake them. It was meant to call them into dignity. It was meant to remind them that unity is not a dream of the past, but a responsibility of the present. The world may describe that moment with phrases and headlines, but for the people who felt it, it was something deeper. It was an Ibrahim Traoré moment, a stirring of ancestral memory, a reminder that leadership rooted in courage can still breathe life into weary nations. And when that courage reached Jamaican shores, elders saw not an outsider's judgment, but a brother's reflection. And so the question now is not what Jamaica felt. It is not even what Africa intended. The question, my friends, is what we will do next. Because movements do not survive on emotion alone. They survive on action, slow, steady, disciplined action. They survive when old wounds are faced honestly. They survive when the diaspora chooses connection over distance. When younger generations choose responsibility over resignation. When elders choose guidance over silence. In Detroit, Chicago, and Atlanta, elders have already begun sharing the message in community groups, recognizing that this awakening belongs to all of us. In Brooklyn, storytellers discuss the meaning of solidarity. In Harlem, pastors preach about accountability with a renewed fire. And in Jamaica, the youth stand at a crossroads, wondering which road leads to a future worthy of their children. This too is an Ibrahim Traoré moment, not the one spoken on the radio, but the one unfolding right here, right now, in the decisions we each choose to make. And throughout the diaspora, elders speak of the profound Ibrahim Traoré reaction, not as gossip or spectacle, but as a sign that a scattered people may yet remember how to stand together. So I ask you, my brothers and sisters, what kind of world do you want our grandchildren to inherit? A world of distance, silence, and forgotten ties? Or a world where Jamaica, Africa, and Black America walk together with dignity? If this message touched you, if it stirred anything in your spirit, then let your voice be heard. Do subscribe, not as routine, but as an act of unity. Share your thoughts in the comments, for your story may ignite someone else's courage. And above all, hold this truth close. We are not finished. We are not done rising. And history is still waiting for our answer.